The night clung to Elena like a second skin, warm and damp, as she stood on the rooftop terrace of the rented condo. Below, the coastal city pulsed, a jagged line of lights tracing the boardwalk, where laughter and music spilled into the dark. The ocean gnawed at the shore, its rhythm steady yet restless, a sound that sank into her bones. She pressed her palms against the cool metal railing, the salt in the air stinging her lips, and let her gaze drift downward. There, by the pool's edge, Lucas and his friends sprawled in a loose circle, their voices rising like smoke. At 50, Elena felt the weight of years in her limbs, in the faint lines etched around her eyes. But the heat of the evening stirred something else, a flicker of something she hadn't named in decades. Lucas, her son, leaned back in a chair, his dark hair catching the pool's glow, oblivious to her watching. He was 20 now, a man in ways that still startled her, his laughter sharp and unguarded. Beside him, Ryan tilted a bottle to his lips, his broad shoulders shifting as he grinned at something Nate said. Nate, quieter, sat cross-legged, his lean frame still, but his eyes, those pale, searching eyes, cut through the haze. She shouldn't have looked so long, shouldn't have let the sight of them, Ryan's easy swagger, Nate's coiled intensity, settle into her like this. But the night was a living thing, pressing against her, and the distance between her and Mark felt wider than the sea beyond. Her husband was downstairs, likely hunched over his laptop, the glow of spreadsheets bleaching the life from his face. 30 years of marriage had worn their edges smooth, but lately it was a smoothness that chafed. "Mom!" Lucas's voice jolted her, and she straightened, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her cheek. He waved up at her, a lazy arc of his arm. "You coming down or what?" "In a minute," she called back, her tone light, practiced. The lie came easily. She had no intention of joining them yet, not when the air up here felt safer, less crowded with the mess of her thoughts. Ryan's head tipped back, his grin flashing white against the tan of his skin. "Better hurry, Elena. Night's young, but we're not waiting forever." His voice carried a tease, rough around the edges, and something in it snagged at her, a hook she didn't want to feel. Nate didn't speak, but his gaze lifted, steady and unblinking. It pinned her there, a quiet weight that made the humid air thicker. She turned away, her fingers tightening on the railing, and drew a slow breath. The ocean's salt coated her tongue, sharp and alive, and she wondered when she'd last tasted anything so keenly. Inside, the condo was a hum of muted noise, Mark's typing, the faint clink of dishes from earlier. She slipped past him, her sandals silent on the tile, and paused by the wide window. Her reflection stared back, a woman in a linen dress, the fabric clinging to her hips, her eyes too bright against the dimness. She didn't recognize the hunger there, not at first, not until she heard the creak of the rooftop door behind her. "Thought you'd hide up here all night," Ryan said, stepping into view. He filled the space, broad chest, damp hair curling at his neck from the pool. His shorts hung low, the hem brushing muscled thighs, and the casual way he moved made her pulse jump. "Didn't know I was hiding," she replied, keeping her voice even. She crossed her arms, a shield against the way he looked at her, not like Lucas's mother, but like something else entirely. Nate followed, quieter, his bare feet soft against the concrete. He stopped a few paces back, hands in his pockets, but his presence was no less potent. The light caught the angle of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble, and Elena felt the air shift, charged, heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Lucas is still down there," Nate said, his tone low, almost a question. His eyes flicked to Ryan, then back to her, and she wondered what he saw. "He's fine," she said too quickly. "He doesn't need me hovering." Ryan laughed, a sound that rolled through her. "Good. More room for us, then." He stepped closer, the heat of him brushing her senses, and she caught the scent of chlorine and something sharper. Sweat, maybe, or the beer on his breath. She should have stepped back, should have murmured an excuse and fled downstairs to Mark's sterile safety, but the night held her, and so did they. Ryan's brazen grin, Nate's unspoken pull. The railing pressed into her back as Ryan leaned in, his voice dropping. You feel it too, don't you? Her throat tightened, but she didn't answer. Not with words, not yet. The rooftop air thickened as Ryan's question hung between them. A thread pulled taut. Elena's lips parted, but no sound came, only the rush of her own blood, loud against the distant crash of waves. She felt Nate's eyes on her, a quiet pressure, and Ryan's heat, too close now, radiating through the thin space separating them. The terrace stretched wide around her, its concrete warm beneath her feet, but it might as well have been a ledge. One wrong step, and she'd fall. Feel what? She managed at last, her voice a brittle thing. She tilted her chin up, meeting Ryan's gaze, dark, bold, unflinching. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, and the knowing in it sent a jolt through her. This, he said, his hand brushing the air near her arm, not touching, but near enough that she felt the ghost of it. The way it hums. You're not down there with him. A nod toward the pool, toward Mark. Because you don't want to be. Nate shifted, his shadow lengthening across the floor. Ryan, he said, a warning laced into the word, but it lacked conviction. His tone was softer, searching, and when Elena glanced at him, she found his brow creased, his lips pressed tight. He wasn't stopping this. He was waiting. I'm here because it's quieter, she lied, uncrossing her arms to grip the railing behind her. The metal bit into her palms, grounding her, but it couldn't steady the way her chest tightened. The ocean churned below, its surface glinting like fractured glass, and she saw herself reflected there, splintered, caught between the woman she'd been and the one clawing to break free. Ryan stepped closer, his sandals scuffing the concrete, and now she could smell him fully. Chlorine, salt, the faint musk of skin warmed by the sun. Quiet's overrated, he said, his voice low, rough with intent. You're not up here for that. Her breath hitched, and she hated how audible it was, how it betrayed her. Nate moved then, closing the distance on her other side, and the air seemed to collapse, trapping her between them. He didn't speak, but his nearness was a current, steady, electric, pulling her under. She felt the brush of his arm against hers, accidental or not, and the warmth of it seared through the thin fabric of her dress. Lucas could come up, she said, the words a flimsy shield. She forced her eyes downward to the pool's glow, where her son's laughter still echoed faintly. It was a lifeline, a reminder of who she was supposed to be. Let him, Ryan said, unbothered. He leaned in, his breath grazing her ear, and the sensation rippled through her, sharp, unbidden. He's not here now. Nate's hand hovered near her waist, fingers flexing as if testing the boundary. Elena, he said, her name a quiet plea, and it was the first time he'd spoken it tonight. The sound of it, soft, deliberate, unraveled something in her, a knot she'd tied too tight. She should have turned away, should have pushed past them, fled to the condo's sterile light, to Mark's oblivious tapping. But the night was a tide, and she was already submerged. Her head tilted, just enough, and Ryan took it as permission. His hand found her jaw, tilting her face toward his, and the roughness of his palm against her skin sent a surge through her, wild, alive. Nate's fingers grazed her hip, tentative at first, then firm, and she felt the dual press of them, Ryan's boldness, Nate's restraint, merging into something she couldn't resist. The world narrowed to this: the heat of their bodies, the salt, heavy air, the distant roar of the sea. Ryan's mouth hovered near hers, not closing the gap, but the promise of it burned. Nate's hand slid upward, tracing the curve of her side, and the contact stole her breath entirely. She was caught, suspended, and the guilt, sharp as it was, drowned beneath the flood of sensation. "What are we doing?" she whispered, the question slipping out, raw and unguarded. It wasn't for them. It was for herself, a last grasp at reason. "Whatever you want," Ryan said, his voice a growl, and he pressed closer, his chest brushing hers. Nate's fingers tightened, a silent answer, and the weight of their combined presence overwhelmed her. The rooftop door creaked downstairs, a faint sound swallowed by the night, and Elena tensed. "Lucas? Mark?" The thought pierced her, but it was too late. She was already falling, into Ryan's unyielding grip, into Nate's quiet pull, into the chaos she'd invited. The ocean roared on, indifferent, as the line she'd drawn dissolved beneath her feet. The rooftop's heat clung to Elena as she descended the stairs, Ryan's bold presence and Nate's quiet pull trailing her like shadows. Her sandals slapped the concrete, each step a tether to the chaos she'd ignited. The condo loomed ahead, its lights a beacon she couldn't face, not yet. She veered toward the boardwalk instead, the night's pulse drawing her into the city's hum, neon signs buzzing, laughter spilling from bars, the ocean's breath heavy in the air. Ryan's voice cut through the din. "Where are you going?" He was behind her, his stride lazy but purposeful, Nate at his side. She didn't answer, her pace quickening past the crowded pier, the salt and sweat of the evening coating her skin. The public bathroom loomed ahead, a squat concrete structure tucked near the dunes, its flickering light a dim invitation. She pushed through the door, the hinges groaning, and the cool, damp air hit her, sharp with the tang of bleach and sea. She stopped at the sink, her reflection a blur in the chipped mirror. Wild hair, flushed cheeks, eyes too bright. The door creaked again, and they were there. Ryan filling the space with his broad frame, Nate a quieter shadow slipping in behind. The lock clicked, a sound that echoed in her chest, and the world shrank to this tiled cell, the hum of the city muffled beyond the walls. "You didn't have to follow," she said, her voice tight, but it was a lie, and they knew it. Ryan stepped closer, his heat brushing her senses, the scent of him, chlorine, salt, raw vitality flooding the space, so Nate lingered near the door, his gaze steady, but his hands flexed, betraying the calm he wore. "Didn't want to," Ryan said, his tone rough, teasing. "Needed to." He reached for her, his fingers grazing her jaw, tilting her face up, and the roughness of his touch sent a surge through her, sharp, electric. She didn't pull away, couldn't. Not when Nate moved too, closing the distance until she felt him at her back, his warmth a contrast to Ryan's fire. The air thickened, heavy with their combined presence, and Elena's pulse raced, a wild thing trapped in her ribs. Ryan's hand slid to her neck, his thumb brushing the hollow there, and the sensation rippled through her, pooling low. Nate's fingers found her waist, tentative at first, then firm, anchoring her as he pressed closer, his breath warm against her shoulder. The dual contact overwhelmed her, Ryan's boldness, Nate's restraint, merging into a tide she couldn't fight. Her head tilted, drawn to Ryan's nearness, and he took it as surrender. His mouth hovered close, not touching but promising, the heat of him searing her lips. Nate's hands slid upward, tracing her sides, and the fabric of her dress bunched under his grip, a soft rustle in the quiet. She felt them everywhere, Ryan's chest brushing hers, Nate's frame molding to her back, and the tiled wall was cold against her palm as she braced herself, caught in their orbit. Time blurred, the moment stretching into a haze of sensation. The damp air clinging to her skin, the faint drip of a faucet, the press of their bodies shifting in sync. Ryan's laugh, low and ragged, vibrated against her, while Nate's silence was a pulse, his fingers tightening as if to hold her together. Her breath came quick, ragged, and the guilt, sharp, inevitable, drowned beneath the flood of them, their hands and heat weaving a rhythm she couldn't escape. The world outside faded, the ocean's roar a distant hum, and here, in this shadowed space, Elena unraveled. Ryan's grip tightened, pulling her closer, and Nate's touch steadied her, their movements a dance of instinct and intent. The mirror reflected them, fractured shapes, a tangle of need, and she saw herself lost in it, a woman at 50, consumed by a fire she'd lit. A shout from the boardwalk jolted her, faint but piercing, and she tensed, the spell fracturing. Ryan stepped back, his chest heaving, a grin flickering despite the interruption. Nate's hands fell away, his gaze dropping, but the weight of him lingered. "We should go," he said, his voice hoarse, the first crack in his quiet. She nodded, her legs unsteady, and smoothed her dress with trembling hands. The lock clicked open, and the night rushed back, loud, alive, indifferent. They slipped out, the cool air a shock against her flushed skin, and the ocean stared back, its surface glinting like broken glass. She'd crossed a line in that bathroom, and the shadows on the shoreline knew it. The boardwalk's clamor swallowed Elena as she stumbled from the bathroom, the night's heat pressing against her like a hand. Her dress clung to her, damp with sweat and the ghost of Ryan and Nate's touch, and the salt air stung her lips, raw from the intensity she'd left behind. The ocean roared to her right, its dark expanse glinting under the moon, a witness to the line she'd crossed. She didn't look back, couldn't, but she felt them trailing her, Ryan's bold stride and Nate's quieter steps echoing in her mind. The condo loomed ahead, its windows glowing against the city's neon haze, and each step toward it tightened the knot in her chest. Her sandals slapped the pavement, the sound sharp against the hum of tourists and crashing waves, and she willed her legs to steady. The memory pulsed through her, Ryan's roughness pinning her to the tiled wall, Nate's steady hands anchoring her from behind, their combined heat unraveling her in that shadowed space. It clung to her now, a weight she couldn't shed. She pushed through the condo door, the cool air hitting her like a slap, and the sterile light sharpened the edges of her guilt. Mark sat at the dining table, his laptop's glow casting shadows across his face, his typing a steady rhythm. He didn't look up, didn't see the flush on her cheeks or the tremor in her hands as she slipped past him. The normalcy of it, his obliviousness, twisted something inside her, a blade of shame and relief. In the bathroom, she locked the door and braced her palms on the sink, the porcelain cold against her skin. The mirror threw back a stranger, hair tangled, eyes too bright, lips parted as if still gasping for air. Water ran in a thin stream, and she splashed it over her face, her neck, the droplets sliding down her collarbone. It couldn't erase the sensation. Ryan's breath against her ear, Nate's fingers tracing her spine, or the way they'd merged into a single consuming force. Her reflection trembled, a woman at 50, fractured by her own hunger. Lucas's voice drifted through the walls, a muffled laugh from the living room, and it pierced her. Her son, 20, carefree, sprawled by the pool with no idea what she'd done. The guilt swelled, a tide threatening to drown her, but beneath it flickered something defiant, a spark she couldn't smother. She smoothed her dress, the fabric creasing under her grip, and stepped out, the condo's hum wrapping around her like a shroud. Mark glanced up as she passed, his glasses catching the light. "You're back late," he said, his tone flat but edged with a question. His eyes lingered, probing, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny, a crack in his usual distance. "Walked the boardwalk," she said, forcing her voice even. "Needed air." She sank onto the couch, the cushions cool against her legs, and stared at the ceiling, her pulse still racing. The lie tasted bitter, but he nodded, returning to his screen, and the moment passed, fragile, untested. Footsteps thudded up the stairs, and the door swung open. Lucas burst in, dripping from the pool, a towel slung over his shoulder. "Mom, you missed it." Ryan spiked the ball right into Nate's face, he said, grinning. The names landed like stones, and she forced a smile, her throat tightening. "Sounds fun," she murmured, her eyes flicking to the doorway as Ryan and Nate followed. Ryan's laugh filled the room, loud and unrepentant, his bare chest glistening with pool water. His gaze caught hers, a flash of something reckless, and her breath hitched. Nate lingered behind, quieter, his hands in his pockets, but the tension in his shoulders spoke louder than words. He didn't look at her, not directly, but she felt the pull of him, a thread stretched taut. "Still up for a beer?" Ryan asked, tossing a can to Lucas, his tone casual, but his eyes daring her to react. Mark's typing paused. A faint hitch, and she felt his glance, brief but sharp. "Not tonight," she said, standing too quickly, the water bottle in her hand slick with condensation. "I'm exhausted." She moved toward the bedroom, their voices trailing her. Lucas's chatter, Ryan's bravado, Nate's silence, and the door clicked shut behind her, a flimsy barrier. Mark joined her minutes later, his presence heavy as he settled into bed, and she lay still, the fan's hum drowning the roar in her head. The ocean stared through the blinds, its surface a fractured mirror, and she knew the shadows on the shoreline weren't done with her. Not yet. The bedroom's darkness pressed against Elena, the fan's drone a frail shield against the storm in her mind. The ocean's roar seeped through the window, relentless, its glinting surface taunting her from beyond the blinds. She lay beside Mark, his steady breaths a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside her. Ryan's bold heat, Nate's quiet pull, the tiled bathroom where she'd lost herself. Her skin still hummed with it, a secret etched into her, and sleep remained a distant shore. Morning broke in slivers of light, the city waking with a hum of horns and gulls. She rose, her limbs heavy, and slipped into the bathroom, the mirror reflecting a woman hollowed out, eyes shadowed, lips tight. The condo stirred as she emerged, Mark brewing coffee, its bitter scent curling through the air, Lucas rummaging for breakfast, his voice bright with plans for the day. She moved through them, a ghost in her own life, her hands trembling as she poured water into a glass. The door thudded open and Ryan strode in, his grin wide, his hair still damp from an early swim. "Last day, huh? Going out with a bang," he said, tossing a towel onto the couch. His eyes caught hers, a flicker of something sharp beneath the bravado, and her pulse jumped. Nate followed, quieter, his gaze skimming the room before settling on her. A brief, piercing look that tightened the knot in her chest. "Something like that," she said, her voice thin, and turned to the sink, the glass slick in her grip. Mark's footsteps paused behind her, the clink of his mug on the counter too loud in the sudden stillness. "You've been off," he said, his tone low, measured. She froze, water dripping from her fingers, and felt his eyes on her, steady, searching. "Since last night, what's going on?" Lucas glanced up from his phone, brow creasing, and the air thickened, a net closing around her. "Nothing," she said too quickly, and forced a smile. "Just tired. This heat." She gestured vaguely, but Mark's frown deepened, his glasses catching the light. "Doesn't feel like nothing," he said, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a crack in his usual detachment, and it sliced through her. Ryan's laugh rang out, breaking the moment, but it was brittle, too loud, and Nate's silence beside him was a weight she couldn't ignore. "Mom, you sure you're okay?" Lucas asked, setting his phone down, and the concern in his eyes, her son's eyes, cut deeper than Mark's suspicion. She nodded, her throat closing, and moved toward the balcony, needing air, needing escape. The salt wind hit her as she stepped outside, the ocean sprawling before her, its surface a restless mirror. Footsteps followed, and she turned to find Nate, alone, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, the words heavy with what they'd done. "There's nothing to say," she whispered, but it was a lie, and he knew it. He stepped closer, the warmth of him brushing her senses, and the memory of the bathroom flared. His hands, Ryan's heat, the way they'd undone her. "There is," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "Lucas asked me this morning, about last night, Where we went. Her breath stopped, the world tilting. What did you tell him? Nothing yet, he said, his jaw tight. But he's not stupid, neither is Mark. The door slid open and Ryan appeared, his grin fading as he caught the tension. What's this? He asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp, darting between them. Before she could answer, Lucas's voice called from inside. Dad, you seen Mom? And Mark's reply came, closer than she'd expected. She turned, and there he was, stepping onto the balcony, Lucas at his side. The air stilled, the ocean's roar fading to a hum, and she felt their gazes. Mark's probing, Lucas's confused, Ryan's reckless, Nate's steady, pinning her in place. Elena, Mark said, his voice cutting through the wind. What's going on? It wasn't a question this time. It was a demand, and the weight of it crushed her. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The truth clawed at her. 30 years with Mark, 20 with Lucas, all teetering on the edge of what she'd done. Ryan shifted, a step toward her, and Nate's hand twitched, as if to stop him, but it was too late. Lucas's eyes narrowed, flicking from her to them, and she saw it. The dawning, the fracture. She started, but the wind stole it, and Mark's face hardened, his suspicions solidifying into something she couldn't face. The shadows on the shoreline had caught her, and there was no outrunning them now. I'm sorry, she said, the words breaking free, raw and final, and the balcony held its breath as her world unraveled, piece by piece, into the sea.